So the final one to fill in, we need to pick up stitches here and pick up stitches here, just like we have been doing, picking up between the ridges. This one up here, you are going to pick up behind that central double decrease, one for every ridge. Same thing going this way. The tricky one is kind of right in here. Let me find my needle. So because we pulled this through, you can always leave that as a loop instead and work with that loop. But for the sake of not losing our stitches, not losing that loop and it coming undone, I pulled it through. So all you have to do is basically follow that yarn right in there. So follow that yarn right in. So when you pick up, you're gonna pick up 10 and 10, so your 11th or the 21st stitch. So stitch number 11. Look at this straight. Pick up 10, your 11th stitch is going to be right in there. So just follow that yarn in. You can take this tail to the back, just kind of push it out of your way. So when you pick up stitches, this will be tucked in behind. And so we're going to use the brown to pick up stitches and pick up stitches. So we'll come back when we get to that one. I wanted to show you another way to weave your ends in as you're going. There's a couple different ways to do this. You can just fold your yarn in half like this so that it's doubled back on to itself. And then when you pick up your first stitch, you put that loop on, scoop up your first stitch, and then when you pick up all these other stitches, you're just going to scoop the two yarns held together. This is fine. Work your way across, and your tail is woven in, all done. I usually do this technique when I'm adding yarn into a project a lot of times, and clasped weft technique, I think it's used in knitting a lot of times, or excuse me, weaving. Because in weaving, when you run out of one yarn, or if you're going to do some sort of patterning, you'll fold this yarn over, pass this yarn through. And so when I'm joining yarn a lot of times, I'll just do this. I'll start here, knit across, and then knit across. My ends, boom, done, woven in. That works great. You could always work this tail into here, work this tail into that working yarn, and then you have a Russian join. So what I'm doing for this technique, instead of just folding it over and working it in like the clasp weft join, I think that's how it's pronounced, I thread the yarn into a darning needle, leaving a bit of a tail. You don't want it too short. And then you just kind of stab through in this spiraling method into the work, or into the working yarn, excuse me. So we've got this darning needle worked through the main yarn. So pull this so that the tail is almost out, not completely, but almost out. We have a loop here because we don't want to lose this loop into here. So feed that through a little bit, kind of do this a few slow times. So once the needle is out of the working yarn, I hold on here and finish pulling the tail through. There we go. So now we have this, and you can kind of slide it up so that it's a little bit smaller of a loop. We don't need a huge loop when we're doing this. Just enough for one stitch. Just kind of keep working that tail. So now we have our tail woven in so that when we knit over, we're still essentially having this folded over and knitting over the tail, but it's incorporated in, so it makes it a little bit easier to pick up the stitch. It makes it easier to knit back over it, and kind of collapses it down so it's not as thick seaming when you are doing that. So that first one, just drop that loop on, pick it up. Sorry, keep it in the camera. So we've got it pulled through there. Just pick up your stitches like you normally would, right down that side. And we're done. Our ends are woven in. This one is great. It doesn't work so well on the knitted cast on, I found, so I always just go back the next right side row and do the weaving in or tacking down your floats technique. But there, my tail's woven in. Leave that last little bit, and now we move on to picking up the stitches until we get into that center stitch. Almost there. Double check my counts. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10. Great. Now, let's pick up that center one so you can see it on camera. There we go. I'm looking over my camera and into my camera. So let's poke in here, following that working yarn, and it gets a little tight because we've been manipulating this. So you can pick up just that top one for picking up your stitch. You don't have to go all the way in, but just go where that tail is and just pick up that stitch with not the tail, but the working yarn. Lift that up through. And so now that is going to continue that ridge line right through this other square. So now let's pick up 10 more stitches headed this way. At this point, you can do weaving in of that tail that was from that first square. So that's what I'm just going to do now. I'm going to weave over and take it back off. It's such a fun little tricky thing to do. Knit, pass the tail over, wrap the yarn around, take the tail off, pick up a stitch, weave it in, tack it down, and then it just keeps going. Bam, done. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Great. Go back, knitting across, and work a mitered square in this space, just like you would that very first one. Knitting across the wrong side row, doing your central decrease on the right side row until we are done. When you come back this direction, you have a couple choices. This tail that goes with this mitered square, you can work it in this direction, or because we're going to be picking up stitches along this edge, once this other mitered square is done, you can weave it in then. Either way. The one that doesn't get woven in is this one over here. This one you really can't work it in as you're knitting, because if you're trying to do weaving in on the wrong side, it's not really something you can do that I have found. I tried one technique, but it wasn't super convenient. So the way this pattern is written is this tail, when we finish and we have all of our mitered squares in a big long rectangle, we are going to pick up stitches on both long edges of that really long rectangle, and that's when I basically weave that in, is as I'm coming down picking up stitches, then do my little weaving in, and then all my ends are being woven in without having to use a needle. We have now finished our fourth and final mitered square in our checkerboard square, and now we have our first finished larger square. The 4 smaller ones make one larger one. From here, we will cast on and pick up stitches along this edge to add the next mitered square, which is a solid one using just the striping yarn, according to the pattern. And then after that, it is another mitered square that's large, a 41 stitch square, where you alternate every other row doing stripes, and it gives a really pleasing effect. So the combination of those 3 squares are what we did. So you're essentially just making, I guess it would be this one, where you cast on and you pick up stitches across the edge for the next 2 squares. Very, very straightforward and just square after square after square. Modular knitting, though, is more than just mitered squares. This is a very good starter beginner project because you're learning how to work decreases in a rhythmic way. You're learning how to pick up stitches in a couple different directions, learning how to cast on and pick up stitches. And it's just, from here, we could do so many different things. We can pick up stitches here and go that direction, this direction, this direction. A log cabin square is a very good example of modular knitting, where you're actually picking up different size shapes, because you'll start with a center block. You'll often add on a square here, but then you're going to pick up for a rectangle here. So the rectangle is twice as long as these two, but same height. So then you'll end up with a square essentially, and then you turn, and then you're going to pick up along that rectangle and then along this edge and turn, and you keep building on and building on, increasing the size of your piece. And sometimes it's squares, sometimes it's rectangles. You can do triangles. If you look up Elizabeth Zimmerman's baby blanket is what it's called. That's another version of modular knitting, in which you have stitches running this direction, and then you have stitches running perpendicular, and it's just created through creating triangles that are nestled together through, if I remember right, it's some decreasing action going on and some short rows, and it's just really neat and really interesting how you can take knitting, and instead of just going side to side, how you can just go in any different direction, and then you still end up with this finished piece. And with ours, though, we'll eventually have this big long rectangle, and then for a finishing edge, we will pick up along the sides more stitches and do some I-cord edging. One of the sides is I-cord edging, the other side is rows of knitting and then I-cord edging, and that gives a nice, I think, pleasing combination of mitered squares and then garter ridges, and how all this garter plays together to show off colors well. Now go ahead and take a look at the list of links I've provided for giving examples of other mitered square projects, other modular projects, and all the things that are out there that you can create with these techniques of either picking up stitches or working some decreases and figuring out all the different directions that your knitting can go with modular knitting. Pun intended.